Hi, welcome to another Retronaut video. So now we're in 1985 and the Commodore 64 scene is in full swing. At this point, I'd been a happy 64 owner for about 3 years, and I had a 64, a 1541 floppy drive, and an ever-growing collection of games. Having said this, as a micro user, you were always reading about new developments from Commodore and of course Atari, Apple, and so on. Both the Commodore 128 and the new Amiga machine had been talked about for a while at this point. Of the two, I recall being more interested in the Amiga. Why? Well, my thinking was the 128 sounded more of an incremental, an evolution of an existing platform, whilst the Amiga sounded more revolutionary. And I think at this point, I was more interested in a revolution rather than an evolution. So in January of 85, the Commodore 128 was finally released. And of course, I was interested, but I found myself sitting on the fence because I really had to wait for the Amiga to be launched, because the critical issue that I wanted to find out about was what was the cost of the machine going to be? Would I be able to get one, or would I have to maybe think again? In July of 1985, Commodore then actually went ahead and launched the Amiga. It was released with great fanfare by Commodore. They put on a special event in New York. And at this event, they had both Andy Warhol and Debbie Harry from Blondie, and they were there to opine about the machine. I think Commodore really wanted to sort of amp up the credentials of this new Amiga as a platform for creators, and you could see why, because it seemed to have some amazing new potential. Of course, being the machine it was, the new Amiga was raved over in Zap64 and also in generalist magazines. Very quickly, we all became familiar with the custom chipset, the different names of all the different chips, and how all these different chips gave the machine so many of its advantages over the Commodore 64, and to be fair, most of the other 8-bit machines. The only problem was, at least for me, and I'm pretty sure for most of the people in the UK, was the launch price. When the Amiga was launched, it was launched at $1,295. Now, as we know from previous videos in this series, at that time, the dollar cost would have pretty much translated into a pound cost. So over here, we're talking about pretty much £1,300 for the new Amiga. The 64 scene at this point, it was in full swing, and great games were still being released for it. In fact, it was during this period that there was a sort of whole new level of game production on the 64. Games graphics really began to shine, and there was a group of great musicians on the 64. They were producing amazing music and increasingly good sound effects to go with ever more sophisticated game designs. So the 64 had never been better, really. And if I'd sold my 64 at that point, as well as my printer, my 1541 disk drive, and all of my games as a bundle, and I had quite a lot of games, then I'd probably only get really something like £400. So sadly, obviously, that's nowhere near the price of the Amiga. I could, of course, trade it up to the Commodore 128. That would have been easy enough to do. But I thought maybe it was a better move to just stick with my 64, keep on saving cash, and in the meantime, just enjoy what the 64 had to offer until there was some kind of price reduction in the Amiga. And that's exactly what I did. Let's fast forward to mid-1987. And at this point, Commodore had finally got round to releasing a new Amiga model, or rather it was actually a pair of Amigas, but at this point we'll focus on the lower priced one, the Amiga 500. It was only available initially in the Netherlands and in Europe, and it actually took until October for Commodore to get round to releasing it in the UK and in the USA. The original Amiga model, that was rebranded to the Amiga 1000, and the new lower cost machine, it was branded as the Amiga 500. And this was done because they were trying to suggest that the Amiga 500 was a cut-down version of the Amiga 1000. But the funny thing was, if you read between the lines, you came to the conclusion that maybe it was a more practical machine, possibly even more capable than the Amiga 1000. What did the Amiga 500 actually feature? It had basically the same logic board on launch. The chipset really wasn't changed much at all. However, it could actually boot directly into Workbench, and that's because the Kickstart ROMs, which actually had to be loaded from floppy disk on the Amiga 1000, they were now held on the logic board of the Amiga 500. This is obviously slightly less flexible because that meant you couldn't change the version of Kickstart. And that was basically that held all the code for the kernel and basically the operating system, which then Workbench relied on. So in that way, it's a little bit less flexible, but at the same time, it was obviously much more practical because you didn't have to boot basically twice to get going with your machine. Also, the 500 had 512K of memory, which was double that of the 1000. I mean, think about it, double that of the 1000, which was pretty amazing. It still had a really decent keyboard, as you can see here, but now it was integrated into the case, whereas in the Amiga 1000, it was actually a separate keyboard. The industrial design of the Amiga 500 actually had a lot to do with the wedge shape of the Commodore 64. I think this Commodore 64C and also the 128C. The 128C in particular was very, very similar to the Amiga. The 512K of the Amiga 500, that could actually still be expanded, but now instead of using a front-based hatch, obviously there's no front on this machine which would allow you to do that. Instead, it was done via a hatch, which was placed on the bottom of the machine. The headline feature for the Amiga 500, for me though, it was the price. It was now only £500. I knew I could sell my C64, and I knew that if I combined that with the savings I'd made between 1985 and that point, that I'd be able to hit that price. So once again, it was time to sell all my kit and trade up. I got my C64 and all of its kit advertised in a local newspaper. And soon I'd sold it to two French guys, as I remember it, who had driven over from Swansea. I'd just enough to order an Amiga 500, and I could even stretch to maybe getting a few games. So I got it ordered, and in October of 1987, a large box was delivered. I remember it arrived in the morning, as I recall, and I had to reluctantly leave it in my bedroom until I returned later that day from school. I think I may have been one of the first people actually to have an Amiga 500 in the UK, because I really did place my order pretty much as soon as it was available to. The box contained the manual, of course, the Workbench discs, the demo discs, and yeah, you know, it looked pretty amazing, really. It also came bundled with a copy of Deluxe Paint. This was made famous by the King Tut image at the time, and it was used to showcase the Amiga's new graphics, which were a big leap ahead compared to the 64 and a lot of other machines. I can still remember opening up the box, getting it running, and then seeing face-to-face some of the demos actually animating, you know, moving on screen. And up until this point, I'd basically only ever seen those demos in magazines, and which meant they were just still images. So seeing it all moving on screen for the first time, that was amazing. For instance, the Boing demo. You know, it looks great in a magazine, the very large ball, but when you actually see it bouncing around live, you know, that was pretty amazing. I've got to say, you know, the Amiga 500 was an amazing machine for its time. There weren't really any compromises. It was built around a 68,000 processor, which had been created by Motorola, and this ran at 7 megahertz. This new processor, it had been designed by Motorola to basically be a mini computer in a single microchip. And what this meant was, it was designed to be multitasking from the ground up. You didn't really have to work too hard to get a machine based on that processor to actually be multitasking. And that was obviously one of the strengths of the Amiga. My machine had 512K of RAM, which was obviously the standard amount. And to put that into context, that was 8 times as much memory as my Commodore 64 had. So that in itself was amazing. The disk drive, which was the new 3.5-inch type, this was a much faster drive than the 1541, which, to be fair, wasn't that difficult. The discs were smaller, they were more robust, and they had a little hatch on them which allowed you to protect the actual relatively delicate floppy disk inside it. The cherry on the cake with these discs was that they also could hold a lot more data. The graphics, well, they were amazing. They featured more colors, and of course they were in higher resolution. And the graphics chips could also shift more sprites, and those sprites could be again in higher resolution and again in more colors. At the same time, it had a new chip, Blitter, which allowed it to move around large blocks of graphical memory at very high speed. And this was actually added to the machine specifically so that it could animate very large sprites, but even more importantly, that it could actually drive the movement of the windows around in its new windowing GUI, which was called Workbench. The sound, That was also a massive step up as well. In person, the keyboard actually felt great. And it was the first time I'd used Workbench, which was pretty much the first windowing system I'd ever used on my own computer. And I've got to say, it was actually pretty capable. It was just a fantastic machine, you know, pretty much the perfect next generation 16-bit machine. And yet it was available at pretty accessible price. And within a few weeks, I could see that the 512K that was built in, it wasn't going to be enough. So I ordered the 512K expansion. And this was then fitted through the trapdoor hatch on the bottom of the machine. Once this was installed, my upgraded machine had now 16 times as much memory as my Commodore 64 had. To put this into context, this 1 megabyte of memory was more than a typical IBM PC of the day, which in itself was pretty amazing. In the early days on my Amiga, I played all of the landmark games, you know, games such as Defender of the Crown and Marble Madness, and these both showed off the abilities of the machine. Defender of the Crown was an original title by a company that branded this game as Cinemaware, and it, you know, had amazing animations, very colorful graphics. The sound was fantastic. You know, it was simply amazing. Marble Madness was a port of an arcade game, which up until that point on the 8-bit machines, I'd always really badly suffered. When it came out in the Amiga 500, it was pretty amazing because it basically looked pretty much like the arcade machine. There was almost no difference between it and the arcade version. My love of Infocom games at this point was reignited as well. I had to buy all of my Infocom games again for my Amiga. I don't think I bought all of them. I think I probably bought some new ones and maybe didn't rebuy some of the ones which I had finished. I had to rebuy them all because I'd sold them all with my Commodore 64. They'd all gone off with the French guys. Now, when I was using Infocom titles, they had higher resolution text, which made a big difference. It was just much easier to read the text. It was also much easier to type on this lovely new keyboard. One of the other things which I didn't really appreciate so much at the time was, probably because it was kind of transparent, was that the faster floppy disk and the 1 megabyte of memory meant that I didn't have to swap anything off disk, basically, on an Infocom game. Once it was loaded into memory, it was there. And that meant that, you know, playing Infocom games on this new machine was just a whole new experience. Everything was incredibly fluid. There were some amazing role-playing games which were ported to the Amiga. These were games which had originally started on the Apple II, and then they'd been ported to the Commodore 64 once it had its disk drive. But now they had a whole new life on the Amiga, where the graphics were greatly improved, the sound was greatly improved. I'm talking about things like the Ultima series, the Bard's Tale series. Those games, they just showed off really how much of an improvement the Amiga was over the 64 and the other 8-bit machines. Further down the line, new role-playing titles such as Dungeon Master and I the Beholder were released on the Amiga. And again, these were at a different level to what was available before. On the Amiga 500, I remember one particular software company, the Bitmap Brothers. They had a run of wonderful games. These spanned a number of different genres. They started off with a shooting title, Xenon, and later they did a sequel for it, Xenon 2. They had an isometric adventure. They did futuristic sports. They had a game called Speedball and Speedball 2. And of course, there was also the character-driven shoot-'em-up, the Chaos Engine. And what all of these games featured was just amazing graphics. The bitmap artists at the Bitmap Brothers were just amazing. I didn't know who they were, but I honestly felt that they were the best bitmap artists in the industry, which was amazing because they were both working at the same studio. The same gang of gamers, the 64 gang in my area, we all moved up to the Amiga 500 pretty much at about the same time. So I was still visiting those guys, and we were all enjoying this whole new environment, you know, with this new hardware. Once again, blank floppy disks, they were in demand. And so we made visits to trade shows to stock up on these new 3.5-inch floppy disks. If there was one negative thing I would say on the Amiga was that I didn't actually carry on coding. And there were a couple of reasons for this. Number one was that on the 64, I'd made the decision basically that I was going to be better probably in the future at art than I was at programming. I wasn't amazingly good at maths. I was probably much stronger at drawing and painting. And I kind of, you know, I was leaning in those directions more and more. So I felt really that maybe that was something I was going to kind of park. When I got to the Amiga, what I found was that I compared it to the 64, and the 64 was a much simpler machine. It had BASIC on a ROM, and as I recall, that BASIC is loaded into memory from the ROM, and then it executes from there. But what you can actually do with the 64 is just flush BASIC out of memory, and then you've got the full 64K of memory to actually write your games in, pretty much. On the Amiga, it was much more complicated. I'd been reading about this in magazines, and basically what it is on the Amiga is that you have a kernel, which is loaded in from ROM. And then on top of that, you've got an operating system. I think it's called Intuition. And then that gives you the operating system, the GUI, workbench, and so on. When you write games for the Amiga, in the very early days, it was very heavily pushed that you would actually write them using Intuition. And what that meant was you had to learn how to code using C, as far as I knew. And then you'd have to obviously work within the new constraints of the machine. So that's the way I understood it. And I just thought to myself, well, is it going to be worth it for me? And I just decided that I wasn't really going to bother with it. Looking back, that's something I regret, because I think actually if I tried it, I probably could have done some pretty decent things on the Amiga. But there was another reason as well why I didn't want to code. As I said, I was into art. On the Amiga, for the first time, I found that you started to get a bit of a 3D graphics workstation. Not a very powerful one, but definitely a machine that you could do 3D graphics on. So after a while, there seemed to be some 3D apps which were coming out, and I knew that that would open a new world of 3D graphics to myself. One of these was called Sculpt 3D. This was the software that was actually used to animate and then render the ray traced juggler demo. And honestly, this demo was just an amazing thing for the time. I can remember seeing it for the first time and being absolutely blown away by what I saw. I think it was actually a friend that came over with some floppy disks, and he put it in the machine. And after a while, it had loaded and played, and yeah, it was just unbelievable. So by today's standards, it looks very crude. But at the time, it combined so many things that were just only now possible on a microcomputer for the first time. So what are these? Well, number one, this demo was actually a video. And until this point, machines just hadn't had enough memory and enough processing speed to actually show images quickly enough that they appeared like a video. So the Amiga had the Blitter chip, and it had enough memory, and it had enough colors and so on to produce decent looking images. That actually produced the appearance of a video. Number two, the images themselves were actually rendered in smoothly shaded 3D. Again, this was something of a landmark. And then thirdly, the shadows and the reflections are ray traced. And that just boggled the mind. What ray tracing means is that basically rays are actually shot from the camera to surfaces, and that's how you determine whether a surface is in shadow or not in shadow. And those rays can then bounce off reflective surfaces, which is true of the sort of mirrored balls, which are seen being juggled. And that means that the mirrored balls can not only reflect the juggler himself, but also the other mirrored balls. So you see reflections of reflections sort of recurring. So if you want to see how groundbreaking this was, go back and watch my last video. And in there, you'll see I show off a little bit of footage of a 3D app on the Spectrum called View 3D. The Spectrum is valiantly rendering a goblet there, shaded, but it's faceted, and it's only in black and white. And it's pretty crude. And that's no disrespect to the Spectrum. It's amazing that it could even do that, really. But now the juggler demo, it was in full color, well, close to full color. It was a video, and it had ray tracing in it. So yeah, this was just amazing. It was groundbreaking at the time, and you felt privileged to have a machine on which you could do such a thing. And I really wanted to find out how I could actually do this for myself. So I put up my feelers, and I managed to get hold of a copy of Sculpt 3D. But the user interface on it, it was extremely hard to use. That wasn't really the difficult part. It was also the rendering speed. Because it used ray tracing, I could do something like make a single sphere, pop a camera, view the sphere from a certain angle, put a light so I get a decent looking shadow, maybe make the sphere into a mirror and then render it. And it would take hours to render that image. Just a single image would take literally hours on end, maybe 3 or 4 hours to actually render just a single image. So if you went back and looked at the juggler demo, you'd have to have multiple spheres. You'd have to position them. I have no idea how they were positioned. I almost think it was done by hand. But basically, to produce that demo must have taken absolutely days, maybe even weeks. And at that point, as an inexperienced 16-year-old, it was all a bit beyond me. But there was other software. There was another package called Videoscape, and that could do pretty good animations. And there was another one called Vista Pro. And Vista Pro focused actually on rendering landscapes, and they both actually did their rendering without using ray tracing, just using, I think Videoscape used flat shaded polygons, and Vista Pro used Garud shaded polygons, and that means they had some kind of smooth shading over each triangle. Because they were rendering without using ray tracing, they were much more productive because you could do an animation on both packages and get it rendered out in a reasonable amount of time. I think Videoscape was actually near real time. It would take, like, say, 2 or 3 seconds per frame because it was using flat shading. Animating on Videoscape was a bit of a chore, I've got to say. The user interface wasn't very good, but it was possible to produce animations, and I did. When you rendered out animations on that package, it would take generally something like half an hour to an hour to render the animation. And then you could cache those into memory, just like the Juggler demo, and actually play it back. So that was pretty sweet. You know, I was already producing animations and playing them back as a video, just like the Juggler demo. So I kind of stepped into the future. Vista Pro, it was pretty similar. As I said, it focused on landscapes. The way you worked with it was you could either generate the landscapes using fractal landscape generation, which tend to produce, reasonably interesting landscapes. Of course, they did look, a bit CG. And then what you could do is you could then save those into files, DEM files, which stood for Digital Elevation Model Files. And this was a file format that was actually used by the US Geological Survey. So because it was used by the USGS, there were actually DEM models of most of America. And when you bought Vista Pro, it actually came with some floppy disks, and on there were models of certain areas of the United States. I remember there were models of, I think it was El Capitan in Yosemite, and I think San Luis Obispo. Yeah, so that was quite interesting. You could load up those models and then you could produce interesting looking images of them. They even had DEM models which were scanned from Mars, and that was incredible because now you can actually render images from the surface of Mars based on real data. There's a giant volcano on Mars called Olympus Mons, and I remember rendering images of that. And there was also an additional package for Vista Pro. And what that allowed you to do was you could load in your DEM file, and then what you could do is you could draw a path over it, and you could give that path certain characteristics like how much the camera would yaw and wobble and turn and twist. And then what it would do is you could actually then set it off and it would render out a sequence of images. It was generally taking, I would think, about something like 20 or 30 seconds to a minute to render each image, so pretty quick. Having said that, you could leave your Amiga 500 on overnight, and by the following morning, you'd actually have a really interesting animation flying over a landscape on Earth, or maybe even flying over Olympus Mons on Mars. Yeah, this was pretty amazing stuff, and I didn't know it at the time, but my Amiga actually helped me move in the future into a career that would lead to me working in video games. I worked on architectural visualization. I rendered images, icons for websites, very early days of websites. And then later I went to work on TV series, animated TV series, and eventually I worked in visual effects in a number of movies for about 10 years, I think it was. So yeah, this machine was the seed of that career. So I've got to be very, very thankful for that. So let's have a look at this machine, and I'll just show you some of the basic features. I've got to say, this is actually not put back together very well. I can lift this case off and the top will come off, so I'm not going to move it around too much when I show it to you. But I'll just basically demo what I can, and yeah, anyway. So this machine was bought locally. When I got it, it was very yellowed, and this was one of the first machines that I actually retrobrighted. It came out looking really good in the end. I'm very, very happy with the results. The keyboard on it is pretty nice. It's a little bit spongy, but it's a very nice keyboard to type on. What you actually see about the case? Well, over here, So look at the ports on the back. So you've got the RGB video out here, and next to it, you've got the video out. Next to it, you've got the power connector, which is a square DIN. Then you've got the parallel port, which by this point was becoming a connection which was actually used less and less. But anyway, it was there. Next, you've got the serial port, RS232, a standard serial port which has been around forever and still useful at this point. Today, if you want to think about the RS232, the best way of thinking about it is that it's now USB. You've got the disk drive connector there, so you can obviously connect up more floppy drives. You've got the audio outputs here. A big upgrade from the Commodore 64 is that this machine is in stereo. Then you've got the joystick port here and the second joystick port, which is also a mouse connector. Yeah, and that's it. This is the mouse for the Amiga 500, and this again was part of, it plugs in the back here. This was part of a sea change in microcomputing for me, because this was the first machine that actually had a windowing UI on it. Workbench, when it first came out, was actually pretty good. Compared to the Mac, it was more colorful. The Mac was basically in black and white, but the difference was the Mac had higher resolution graphics. I think Steve Jobs made quite a good move in the fact that he focused on getting a resolution for the Macintosh that allowed it to have a very high resolution UI, although it was in black and white initially. So the Amiga 500 had a number of colors. I think it was 4. But because of that, it had a lower resolution. And this machine really was aimed more at video. It had built-in Genlock capability. And what that meant was this machine had the ability to synchronize itself with a video signal of the day. Back then, video signals were a lot more complicated than now. And that meant that basically the scan line of the TV and the drawing of the Amiga could be synchronized, so they were perfectly in sync, and you didn't get any tearing between the two signals. And that meant that this machine was actually perfectly suited for doing video production. The downside of that, because it was so strongly integrated with that video signal, was that its higher resolution video modes were interlaced. And that was problematic because it meant it wasn't so useful for doing desktop publishing and, other productivity work. It was kind of similar in a way to the Atari ST. The Atari ST's superpower was it had MIDI ports, which meant it was very suited to doing music production because you could literally just plug in any MIDI capable instrument of the day and off you went. You could write music and then, get the machine to actually play the keyboard for you. I wasn't into music at that time. I was interested in it in that I dabbled with it, but it wasn't something that I did as a hobby, and it wasn't something I wanted to do professionally. So for me, the Amiga actually was the better choice out of the two. It was the machine that was more geared towards graphics and also video and doing animations, and yeah, that made a lot more sense for me. On the underside of the machine, as I said, is the hatch here. This is the hatch where you would actually put the memory expansion. Now then, talking about memory expansions, I've actually got the memory expansion for this machine over here, and this was bought on eBay recently. It's a 1990 expansion, and what's interesting about it is that it doesn't actually have any RF shield. If you bought one of the early Amigas and you bought the memory expansion back in those days, it was much larger than this, about this size, and it had a large wedge-shaped RF shield on it made of metal. By this point in 1990, they'd obviously given up on that. And this one actually has a coin battery which goes in here to back up the time on the machine. So that's a decent design. This is actually the memory expansion which came with the machine. This is where the memory chips went, and this is where I think some kind of ROM went. And this is actually similar to a battery which was attached to this. It was attached here. It was a bit smaller. There are 3 pins here where it was attached. Why is the battery missing? Well, like so many batteries from machines of this age, it actually leaked inside the memory expansion. And unfortunately, the guy who sold it to me didn't realize that this was a thing. And he was very happy that his Amiga was in pristine condition, because this was his machine back in the day. but sadly, inside the memory expansion, something very bad was going down. You can't see it on camera there, but all of the pins here are very green. And that's where the alkali from the battery is leaked. It wasn't actually this battery. This is in good condition. This basically doesn't work anymore. I've taken the chips out of it because I just thought that it might be useful for something else. But again, you can't see it, but the sockets here are actually not intact anymore. Some of the pads are actually missing. So even if you did plug in the chips, it's probably not going to work. Why have I kept this? Well, I actually would like to try and get this working in the future. I think it's quite a simple little electronics project. And I think I've never actually installed a socket for a microchip. And this seems like the perfect project to learn that on, because at the end of the day, if I don't get it right, I'm not breaking anything because it's already broken. And if I get it right, hopefully I can get it working again. So that would be really cool to actually get this working again. I've cleaned it thoroughly. I use vinegar to get all the electrolyte off. And yeah, a project for the future. I've got all the microchips in a box over there. So yeah, this is the Amiga 500, a fantastic machine, and a machine that basically dominated the microcomputer scene in the late 1980s and into the early 1990s. In the next video, we're actually going to jump forward quite a bit, and we're going to look at the other machine, which was released at the same time as this machine. But I actually bought a sort of cheaper version of it called the Amiga 1500. And that machine was aimed at people who wanted to actually do graphics with their machine. You know, it was more of a power platform. At this point, I'm just enjoying games on my Amiga 500 mainly, and I'm dabbling in 3D. But as I became more interested in 3D and I became more professionally interested in it, I decided to upgrade and get something more professional. That'll be interesting to look at. So yeah, the Amiga 500. I hope this little video has given you a little bit of insight into what it was like in the middle of the 80s to have this machine turn up. And if you did like it, please click on the like button. And obviously, if you like this video, then it would be great if you could subscribe to the channel as well, because that will really help it to grow. In the next video, as I said, we're going to look at the Amiga 1500, and that was a major step up, and that'll be really interesting in as well. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.